welcome to the second session of our Catholic social teaching, Human Being is Social. And I now turn it over to Father Ken, who will be speaking about the implications of the person as social in his second presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Father.
What I'm going to do tonight, and you can follow along with the slide presentation, is last week, as you recall, we began by talking a bit about the Catholic imagination or the Catholic worldview. And then I suggested to you that Catholic social thought is really built upon a foundation of an understanding of the human person, and that the two main pillars of that foundation are the claim that the human person is sacred and social. And last week, we talked about what are the implications of maintaining that the human person is sacred, and talked a little bit about the importance of the doctrine of creation and incarnation. And then I suggested to you that among the implications that the tradition draws out from the claim that the human person is sacred is one that human beings have an innate dignity which cannot be denied or eradicated. And that secondly, that human beings possess rights that are meant to be expressive of how one protects and promotes that dignity in various social, political, economic arrangements. And then towards the end, I proposed that as important as rights language is within Catholic social teaching, there's also a recognition that we need more than rights. It's awkward to talk about things like friendship, forgiveness, compassion, love, as if these things are rights that we have.
Turn back on, excuse me.
Yet nonetheless, human beings do need forgiveness, compassion, friendship, love, and the like, so that there's more to the human person and more to human dignity than rights, even as important as rights may be. What I want to do tonight is take up the second part of that foundational view of the human person, and to talk about the human person as social, inherently social, and what some of the implications are of that claim, that a human person is inherently social, and what Catholic social teaching does with that claim. So as you see there on the screen, the first thing I want to suggest to you is that the Catholic social tradition really wants to emphasize that community is at the heart of the human experience. That in fact, we only realize our dignity in the context of community. So the Catholic social tradition takes a somewhat different starting point than an awful lot of Western political theory that tends to begin with the individual and then tries to think through how does the individual relate to the community. Whereas Catholic social teaching starts with the premise that the human person is innately social, is innately communal, and that this idea that you can understand a person outside of community or apart from community is really a mistake. I think a nice example of this, we see it right in the book of Genesis. You all know the story of creation in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. And you recall that in chapter 1, the account of creation there in chapter 1, when God creates each of the days of creation, as God creates both the earth and creates the water and creates the skies and the like, there's always this pronouncement, and God saw that it was good, and God blessed it. The end of the first day, the beginning of the second day. And that refrain comes in again and again, that God sees what has been created and God calls it good and blesses it. In chapter 2 of Genesis, when it comes to the account of the creation of the human person, what's interesting is in verse 18, after creating the first human person, we're told in verse 18, the Lord God said, "It is not good for the person to be alone." And then immediately we go into the creation of the counterpart to the first human being, and you get the story of Adam and Eve. But the point to see is that right there in the biblical witness, this idea that for the human person to be alone is not good. That's not how we are to understand the human, that the human person only grows and develops within the context of community. And so the Catholic tradition tries to sort of walk a middle ground between those political and economic theories that would emphasize the individual, but also those political and economic theories that would emphasize the collective. And rather, what the tradition tries to say is, no, human beings matter, and we have to take each individual as valuable and dignified in their own right, but that dignity only gets realized in a relational context, in a communal context. So it's not that we prize the group over the individual or the individual over the group, but it's precisely individuals in community is what brings about human flourishing. So the example I've used oftentimes in trying to explain this sort of outlook to students is I pose to them the question about how do you get a good flowers or good fruits or vegetables when we plant them? Now, one thing we could do is we could go out here outside the Siena campus and plant things along Route 9. And we could just put them along the borders of Route 9, along the lawns there on Route 9. And, they would be subjected to the pollution that comes from the trucks and the buses and the cars that drive along Route 9. There might be some people that come along and trample on those flowers or fruits planted there. There may be the occasional animal, whether it's a squirrel or something else that might go munching on what's growing there. But there's still the chance that even in such a sort of unfriendly atmosphere, that you might get some flowers or fruits growing right there along Route 9. After all, we sometimes get terrific human beings that come out of horrific circumstances and a horrific environment. So it's not as if that we cannot get plants and various flowers flourishing even in a bad environment. But if you wanted to heighten the odds of getting good growth, you might want to put it into a well-maintained greenhouse. And in that setting, the odds of getting flourishing plants really goes up because you've created an environment that's very hospitable and nurturing of plants that allow a plant to flourish under properly maintained conditions. And that's really what the Catholic tradition tries to argue for in terms of the importance of community. That if you really want to get flourishing human beings, if you really want to help individual persons to grow, mature, and develop in ways that lead to really a successful person's life, then the odds get greatly increased if you put people in the context of good community. It's not to say that you can't get good people even in adverse circumstances, but you certainly raise the expectations and the odds if you put people in the context of really healthy, good, well-maintained environments. And so community is really central to Catholic social teaching. Again, not because we prize the group over the individual, but it's precisely because the best way to get healthy, good, flourishing individuals is to put them in the context of good communities. So one other thing that the tradition tries to hold up is that we come up with definitions of community that are not exclusive, but inclusive. That is, we want communities that do not shun individuals or ban individuals or push them outside the community. We want communities that welcome, accept, and work with individuals to help each person flourish and grow. So the outlook that I think Catholic social teaching encourages is what I'm calling, and I'm not original in this, this is used by others as well, is to say that the Catholic social tradition is neither individualistic nor collectivist, but rather it's communitarian. That what the tradition talks about is it puts the emphasis on what are the conditions for creating good community, with the belief that precisely by doing that, that's one of the best ways of helping to create good persons. So the interest is in the dignity of the person, but the belief is one of the best ways for a person to realize their dignity is to find themselves living in the context of a supportive, nurturing, nourishing community. A second aspect of this is the importance of participation. This is something that one finds in a document that Paul VI, if you remember him, Paul VI, who was Pope, came in after John the 23rd in the middle of the council. John the 23rd died after the first session of the council. It was Paul VI who was Pope during the final 3 sessions of the council, brought it to a successful conclusion, and then remained as Pope on into the 70s, the mid-70s. And in a document that Paul wrote in 1971, it was a document called Call to Action. In paragraph 22 of that document, I'll just read the line to you. Paul is trying to talk about what's the world look like from his viewpoint as he looks out at the world and he's trying to understand what's happening. What are the trend lines going on in the world around him? Paul says the following. While scientific and technological progress continues to overturn human surroundings, our patterns of knowledge, work, consumption, and relationships, there are 2 aspirations, right? Aspirations or hopes. There are 2 aspirations that persistently make themselves felt in these new contexts, and they grow stronger to the extent that persons become better informed and better educated. The aspiration to equality and the aspiration to participation. These are 2 forms of human dignity and freedom. I want to say something about participation here. Equality, I think we all have some sense of that. But what's Paul getting at with participation? What Paul begins to see is that we live in an age where people want to be able to have some say, some engagement with the communities that they're part of, and not simply be subject to the decisions of others. Paul realized that a great many people have experienced life as something that goes on somewhat over their heads. You know, I remember talking in a somewhat humorous way with a friend who worked at the Pentagon years ago when I was living in Washington. And the Pentagon, as you know, is the largest office building in the United States. It's really a huge building. And there are tens of thousands of people who work in that building. And I remember talking with this fella, and he was a sort of mid-level member of the military, uniform military. He had a responsible position and assignment in the Pentagon. And I was saying to him, and we were talking about what's that like? And he said to me, well, Ken, you have to understand that even for someone like myself, I often get the feeling that somebody's making decisions around here, but it's not me, right? Decisions are being made and they're somewhere up there, and eventually they come down on my head, but I'm not the person making the call. And I think an awful lot of people feel that way, that a lot of what goes on in our nation and in our world politically or economically, culturally, that we experience it as it's happening to us. Somehow we're directing it or we're guiding it. That the decisions are being made by someone or some group, but it ain't me. And what Paul was talking about here in 71 was that that feeling does lead to a sense of frustration and resentment, and in some cases, real anger among people, that decisions that affect their lives, they have no voice in it. And that's what he means by this sense of people do have this aspiration to participation, that people want to have some ability to shape and decide things that are going to affect their lives and the lives of their communities. And so it's to be contrasted with an overly paternalistic approach to community, whereby there are small elites, small oligarchies that really run the show, and the rest of us just dance to the tune that they decide to play. And what Paul is talking about is, in the modern world today, more and more people want to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And he talks about that politically. It's why so many people strive for some sort of democratic approach to politics, that people are tired of the idea of an aristocracy running their political community, or a monarch, or tribal elders or chiefs, but that people want to have greater say in the politics that affect them. But it's also true economically, Paul says. And so he talks about that in many places today, there are people looking for different ways of thinking about how workers should be treated, plans for worker ownership of various firms or corporations, workers having profit-sharing plans, that they just don't work for set wages, but they also have a right to have some percentage of the profits that are created. Things like employee stock ownership plans, things like this. These are all attempts at trying to introduce into economic life a sense that people have, I have a stake in this. I'm not just a passive recipient of the decisions of others, but I have some role in all this. What this requires, of course, not just in political institutions, but also in economic institutions, is the experience of transparency. You can't make decisions if you don't have the information that you need to make them, if you don't have some awareness of what in fact actually is going on. And so transparency becomes an important dimension of any group or collective institution, that the people who are part of it have some understanding of how decisions are being made, why they're being made, with what resources are they being made, based on what information are they being made. So implications of claiming that the person is innately social, first of all, is the importance of community and the great interest we have in forging good communities, because that's what hopes to bring about good individuals. Secondly, that we have this underlying communitarianism that talks about what are the conditions for the possibility of good community, and that increasingly in the modern world, one of those conditions is the hope of more participation and less paternalism in our communities and societies. Dave, if you go to the next slide, please. A third aspect of this concern for the human is the way the Catholic tradition talks about justice. Justice within the Catholic social tradition is multidimensional. Traditionally, and this goes back, it starts with Aristotle, and as I think I mentioned to you last week, Aquinas was greatly influenced by Aristotle and adopted many of Aristotle's categories and sort of, you might say, baptized Aristotle within the Catholic tradition. It was Aristotle who talked about the multiple dimensions of justice, and Aquinas adopts this and talks about justice in three forms. The first is what is called commutative justice. That's probably the least common term that you might be familiar with. You've heard of legal justice and distributive justice, I'm sure. Commutative may be a little less well known. But basically, commutative justice is the justice that regulates one-to-one relationships. So a contract negotiation is a negotiation of commutative terms. I ask you if you will repair my car, and you agree to repair my car, and you say it will cost X amount of dollars. My obligation to pay you is an obligation that flows from commutative justice. Your obligation to actually repair the car is what flows from an obligation of commutative justice. So commutative justice is the bargaining between individuals about services or a good that one is going to produce or is willing to trade or sell or the like. This kind of justice, we might call it blind justice. That is, you're not much interested in whether or not I find your price expensive or I find your price cheap. You say this is the price. Pay it or not. You don't have to pay it, but if you want me to repair the car, you got to pay that price. And if I want you to repair the car, I pay it, right? I may not care whether or not your business is flourishing, or in fact, your business is about to go under. I'm not going to pay you any more than what you asked for. And so that's what's meant by it being blind. We don't pay attention to my need or your need. We simply agree on this service merits this payment. And if we can agree on that, we're treating each other justly. Legal justice refers to what does an individual owe the group. Now, I'll talk about in a second how this got distorted over the years. But when Aquinas used this term of legal justice, he didn't mean civil law. He was talking about the natural law. And what he meant by that was, what is it that I have a moral obligation to in terms of working with and supporting and participating in the communities of which I'm a part? So if I say I'm part of the St. Vincent community, what is it that in justice I owe to that community? What can others in the community expect me to contribute to make the community whole and functioning and flourishing? That's how Aquinas understood the term originally. It was legal in the sense of the natural law, not the civil law. It was, what's the moral obligation of being part of a community? What do I owe to others if I say I'm part of the same group? But what began to happen over time, such that by the 1800s or so, remember Aquinas is writing at the end of the 13th century, hundreds of years later, the term has evolved and it's become identified not with the natural law, but with the civil law. And it reduces this to sort of say, what do I have to do to be obedient to law? And so it takes a sort of minimalist or reductionist reading of my obligations. My obligations are to society. I just have to obey its laws. So I'll drive on the right side of the road. I'll pay my taxes. I'll maintain, obedience to criminal law. I won't engage in any sort of violation of the criminal law. I will be a, quote, good citizen. And all that asks of me is obey civil law. Don't do things that are illegal. But you can see how that's a more minimal rendering of my obligation to others than Aquinas's question of, what do I owe to the community to help the community flourish? This is satisfied with mere external obedience to the civil law. The third type of justice is what's called distributive justice, a term that you probably are also familiar with. And this is what governs relationships between the group, society, and me. That is, what are the benefits that come from society? What are the burdens that are attached to being part of a society? And how do we distribute the benefits and the burdens in a just way? That's the concern of distributive justice, that we see to it that everybody gets a share of the benefits of being part of the group and also has to carry some of the load, some of the burden that makes for keeping a group flourishing and doing well. Now, this is a way of thinking about justice that is not blind, because Aquinas says what the group must always be looking at here is, what needs does a person have? And so here, the group may legitimately say, this person has special needs. Perhaps they have a medical crisis. Perhaps it's a child who has a learning disability. Perhaps it's somebody who has, great tragedy has befallen the family. One of the parents has died. In other words, here the group quite legitimately looks at, do some people have certain special needs that we need to recognize they need more attention or more of our resources than perhaps somebody else who doesn't have that special need. So we may have special tutors for a child with a learning disability. We may want to make sure that our buildings are accessible to people who have physical disabilities. It may be that we're going to provide some sort of financial supplements to people who are aged or people who have lost the main income-producing member of a family. That it's quite appropriate in a society to look at people's needs here and not just treat everybody as exactly the same across the board, but a good community looks at, what does the individual in this community need in order to flourish? And some people's needs might be different than others, and the community can rightly attune its distribution of benefits and burdens in light of that. It doesn't say that we can then ignore personal effort or an individual's productivity or the risks that some people take to be producers in a system. All it's saying is those factors can all be brought into an assessment of what the community owes to an individual. But you start with first trying to assess needs. The fourth way of understanding justice is to talk about social justice. And this is now related again to the legal point. Social justice gets introduced, really it's a term that begins to emerge in the 19th century in Europe and comes into the Catholic social tradition for the first time in any official way in 1931 with a letter that Pius XI wrote right in the heart of the Great Depression, which was a worldwide depression back then in 1931. And Pius XI writes a letter about the state of economic justice during the Great Depression. And in that letter, he talks about that there are demands of social justice that must be recognized in the economy. And all sorts of people started scrambling around to find out, what did he mean by this, social justice? What is that? Because they knew commutative and legal and distributive from the tradition, but they didn't know what social was. Later on, Pius doesn't explain himself in that 1931 letter, but later on he does in later writing. And what became apparent was Pius was basically talking about what Thomas meant by legal justice. That was social justice is getting past just the bare minimum of being legally just to ask, what do good people owe to a community that they are part of and that they want to see flourish and grow? And so what Pius was really talking about was, how do we create institutions in a society that really help people mature and flourish? And that may ask more of us than simply doing the bare minimum of not acting illegally. It may ask us for more effort, more sacrifice, at least on the part of some. I have a little three-sentence statement there you may see under the heading of social. You may recall we talked about this if you were part of the group that we met last year talking about the moral life. And I introduced this idea of social evil. And I explained it by understanding this little three-part dictum. Society is a human project. That is, societies are created by human beings, right? We create society. Society doesn't fall down from the sky. It doesn't just pop up naturally. Human beings create and build and shape societies. Secondly, society is an objective reality. What's meant by that is, once human beings create a society, there now is something out there that's not just in my head. That society is not just some idea that I have now, or we have now, created a society that has certain practices. So, for instance, you and I live in a society here in the United States. There's a financial system, a banking system. If you want to buy a house, you look for a mortgage. And you just can't create this financial system. You just can't go up to somebody and say, here's what I want you to loan me, and here's what I'm willing to pay for it. You've got to work with established rates of interest. You've got to pay attention to what the Federal Reserve is doing with the prime interest rate, how banks are responding to that, whether we're getting lower rates on 30-year mortgages or 20-year mortgages. You have to deal with the institution now of banking that wasn't there before you created a society with a banking and financial system. But now that that's there, you can't ignore it. You run up against it when you're talking about any sort of major financial expenditure or cost. Same thing is true in terms of an educational system, right? Once you create a system like we have here in the United States, you're not free to just let your child roam free in the streets and hope they'll bump into a mentor somewhere who will tutor them, right? You have to make sure that this child has a certain amount of formal education. You may do it through homeschooling. You may do it through a public school system. You may do it through private institutions. But society sets standards of literacy. It sets standards about how many years of formal education each child should be provided for. It sets expectations on parents and guardians about seeing to it that each child gets a decent and fair education. In other words, we created institutions, right, that now exist apart from just our will. We created an objective reality. And that's true in terms of any number of other institutions in our social life. Society is not just simply something that we imagine. There really are institutions, practices out there that you and I have to take into account as we negotiate life together. That leads to the final point. The person is a social product. You and I are different kinds of people because we live in 21st century United States than if we lived in 19th century of the United States, or if we lived in the 21st century in Thailand or in Argentina. That societies will shape and influence who we are. Now, the important thing here is, do not read this as premise, conclusion, that the conclusion is the person is a social product. If that's the only conclusion, that's a kind of social determinism. That's not what we're promoting here. Each of the three statements is equally valid and has equal weight, all right? Yes, the person is a social product. You and I are deeply shaped and created by the environment in which we live, right? But don't forget the first point. The environment in which we live is a social product. We're always making and remaking and transforming the environments in which we're in. So yes, we're being shaped by our culture, but we're also creating the culture at the same time. And second point, the culture is not just, the society is not just a thought we have. We create institutions, objective realities that limit or enhance our abilities to function and flourish within the life of a society. So all three of those dimensions, I'm going to count the social as actually properly understood legal justice. All three of those ideas, commutative, legal, social, and distributive, are part of what the Catholic tradition means when it asks, what are we talking about in terms of a just society? Dave, if we go to the next slide, please. And here we talk about a vital part of the understanding of the Catholic tradition, which is the importance of the common good. The Catholic tradition believes there are some goods that are not simply the sum of individual goods. So if you took, sort of a basic course in economics at some point along the way, or you ever read any of Adam Smith, you would know in Adam Smith's famous treatise on the wealth of nations, Smith talks about that the genius of capitalism is it encourages every individual to pursue their own self-interest. And in doing that, the presumption is We know what we're interested in because it appears to us to be good. And so each of us pursues the good as we understand it to be. And each of us individually pursuing our own self-chosen goods, Smith suggests, as if guided by an invisible hand. He actually uses that term, as if guided by an invisible hand, all of us seeking our individual goods wind up creating the common good of society. I want to suggest to you that that is profoundly not the way the Catholic tradition thinks about the common good. Instead, let me just use a little parable that explains the Catholic tradition's view of the common good. Imagine, if you would, that we have a common pasture land out here in Loudonville, where I am. There's a common pasture land, and that pasture can handle 100 sheep. That we have 100 sheep who every day, the 10 of us who are the shepherds of Loudonville, we go out there, we each have 10 sheep, we bring our sheep out there, and we let them graze, and we let them eat grass, and we let them crap on the grass and do all the things that sheep do out in a pasture. The 10 of us, each with 10 sheep, in a pasture that can sustain 100 sheep. Life is good. Everything is going fine. But at some point, this fellow Himes begins to realize, hey, if I had an 11th sheep, what would happen? Well, an 11th sheep means 101 sheep. But the cost of that 11th sheep gets shared among all the other sheep and all the other shepherds. So the cost of my adding one more sheep is 1/10, because the other 9/10 is going to be picked up by the other 9 shepherds and their sheep, right? But the benefits of having an 11th sheep all accrue to me. I get all the wool. I get all the lanolin. And when the time comes, I get all the lamb chops. And so, if I'm thinking in terms of my self-interest, why not get an 11th sheep? I get all the benefits of the 11th sheep. But what that 11th sheep does to the pasture land, that gets shared among everybody. So 1/10 is my debit, but 1 is my gain. Hence, I'm going to get an 11th sheep. But Dave, who's been watching me doing this, he's not foolish, and he decides the same math works for him. So he'll get an 11th sheep. Right? And then another person will get an 11th sheep, and another. And eventually I'll get a 12th sheep. And so sooner or later, at some point, we're now going to have 110 or 120 or 130 sheep on that pasture. And then what? The pasture is no longer sustainable. We've overpastured the land, and the commons that fed those 100 sheep and handled those 100 sheep now deteriorates because of the overuse of too many sheep on the pasture. The point being, there are some goods that are not simply the sum of everyone pursuing their own individual good. There are some goods that are truly communal. We either all share in them, or we all suffer from their deterioration. One of the obvious things here is pollution, right? If I have a factory near a river and I want to get rid of my pollutants, well, rather than pay a hauling firm to come in and haul away all the terrible chemicals or refuse or waste that I'm producing in my factory, I just run a big pipeline from the factory right out into the Hudson. Let it all go there. I save on the cost of my dealing with my waste, And who pays for that pollution? Everybody who uses the Hudson, not just me. But that logic that explained my behavior is going to explain the behavior of the person competing with me, who all of a sudden has to deal with the fact that I'm producing goods at a cheaper cost than them because I don't have the overhead of dealing with my waste. Well, that person's going to say, build a pipeline into the river for their waste. And another company will do the same. And pretty soon, you have a Hudson River that you can walk across because it's so polluted and messed up, right? And how do you stop that from happening? By putting in laws and institutions that say Hines and Dave and everybody else can't dump their crap in the Hudson River. You got to haul it away to a landfill. You got to treat the chemicals so that they are not damaging the water or the air around the Hudson Valley. But who's going to do that? Who's going to create that policy and who's going to enforce it? And that classically in Catholic social thought is why you have a state. You have a state in order to protect and promote the common good. Because without someone looking out for the common good, what you'll have is individuals narrowly pursuing their interests at the expense of the common good. So the claim is of the Catholic tradition that there really are some goods that are communal. And if you leave it to individuals, individuals will not care for common goods. The simple example that I use with students is, what if Siena forbade the use of private cars among the student body? And instead, we said every dorm has 12 cars that Siena supplies the dorm with. Every dorm gets 12 cars. Who is going to put gas in that car? If I can drive the car and it's not on empty, I'll drive the car with whatever gas is there. And I'll come back. I'm going to stop at a gas station and fill it up for somebody else, or will I leave it for the next person to come who walks in and finds the needle on E? Who's going to clean the car, right? Who's going to see to it that the car gets regular maintenance? There are some goods that the simple fact of the matter is, if I can avoid the cost of the good and still get the benefit of the good, why would I pay the cost? Narrow self-interest winds up neglecting common goods. And so part of what the Catholic tradition tries to hold up is this idea that there are communal goods that communal institutions have to look out for and protect, because left to individuals, it won't happen. Now, this refers to another basic principle in Catholic social teaching called the universal destiny of goods. And that is simply the idea that when God created the world, God created the world for everyone. God did not create the world that some would have exclusive use of resources and others would have no access to resources. So that part of the task of government is to make sure that we recognize that even in a system of private property, there are claims that communities can make on private property. That no one should have such monopoly in private property that vast numbers of other people have no access to resources that were originally destined for the good and the benefit of all. The problem is, and the flaw in our system today, is that we live in a world where we have states who look out for domestic common goods. But who looks out for international common goods? Who looks out for the universal common goods? And it was John the 23rd who suggested we have a structural flaw in our human world. And that is, we've come up with a system of national government to talk about domestic goods, but we don't really have any structure that protects and serves international common goods. We try to create certain things: international law, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization. We try to build some kinds of institutions that will make some sort of contribution to supporting and helping a common good that's international. But as we all know from the climate crisis, right, it's very hard to get all these individual nation states on board with the same agenda to care for a common good that is vital to us today. And we're suffering because we really don't have, as humanity, we don't have mechanisms that really look out for and protect and promote international common goods. Let me just skip the bottom things there under D for the sake of time and get to the final area here in terms of implications that flow from this communal notion of the person. And that is the great virtue that has appeared in recent times in Catholic social teaching is the virtue of solidarity. It's distinct from interdependence. It arises because of interdependence. But the point is, nations and people can be interdependent, right? But that doesn't mean their relationship is fair or just. So we all know the United States is heavily reliant upon certain other nations for the production of natural resources that our industrial society and our postmodern communication society, we take those raw resources and we manipulate them and use them and manufacture with them, and we create sophisticated end products from that. We pay low prices for the natural resources from the countries that supply us, but for them to buy the goods that we produce from those natural resources, the price is much higher. So even though we and certain, say, poorer countries are interdependent, one of us has great benefits from present trade arrangements, and some other people are suffering getting the short end of those trade agreements. And that's why interdependence doesn't guarantee fairness. And what the tradition begins to talk about is this idea of this virtue of solidarity. It's the virtue that asks us to go beyond mere interdependence to move towards genuine concern for the well-being of others with whom we may have a distant relationship. It's the exact opposite of the evil of marginalization. That is, the term marginalization refers to people who are living on the periphery of the communities of which we're part. Who are those people who are so far removed from our sort of realm of moral concern that we almost never think about them? The people who are working under dangerous conditions, mining in poor nations and producing raw materials that we then import, but we give hardly any thought to the conditions under which those miners are living. Or even in our own society, we have people who are living and working in jobs that are quite dangerous and low paying, and many of us rarely think about the people who are working in, and packaging the foods that we're getting or the goods that we're getting. There's a danger in a society that we push certain people off to the periphery and they almost become excluded from our range of compassion. And the challenge of solidarity is to overcome marginalization and keep trying to bring people back into the center of our moral attention so that we don't go through our lives living off the hard work of people who are working in sweatshops and in really oppressive conditions, manufacturing our clothes and other goods that we're driving for the cheapest possible price. And there are children working in these sweatshops in countries in Southeast Asia and other places in conditions that we would never allow our own children to be put into. That's the task of solidarity, to have the distant neighbor not be marginalized, but become real to us, so that we think about how do we help to overcome the inequality, which is a sign of our times, the great disparities between wealthy nations and poor nations, and even within nations between the 1% and people who are really struggling with to acquire basic goods. Remember when I read to you Paul VI before? Remember he said 2 great aspirations. One was participation. The other one, he says, is equality, right? We talk about every person being equal in dignity, but we have not really translated equality and dignity to anything like equality of standards by which people live. That the radical disjunction between the haves and have-nots is really one of the negative signs of our times in our culture. And that's why the tradition has talked about what's called the preferential option for the poor. That is, that you and I, as Catholic Christians, really need to sort of train ourselves to always be asking, who is on the margins? That the real test for community is not asking, how are the best off doing in the community? The real test for community is to ask, how are the least well off doing? Do even the least well off have at least their basic needs being met? That's the real test of community within the Catholic tradition.
She said, you know, we pull an actual Mrs. Obama.
So in terms of this point about solidarity, one of the new ideas that's come here, and I'm just touching upon it here, I recognize is, it's not only we're beginning to realize the importance of having solidarity with other human beings, we're coming to understand the importance of solidarity with all of creation, right? That one of the ways in which we move towards a sustainable environmental future is we start taking seriously the dignity of non-human creation and appreciating the goodness of the entire created order, not just the goodness of humans. This raises a point, and allow me as a Franciscan to get my plug in here for the Franciscan reading of the Catholic tradition. But Friday is the Feast of St. Francis, so you might as well get it from me now as a preview, right? Francis, when you all probably know that Francis was known for poverty and living poorly. And the great mistake that a lot of people deal with when they think about Francis and poverty is they think only in terms of Francis and material poverty. And that was true. He lived an incredibly simple life in terms of material goods. But there was more to it for Francis than that. Francis was deeply aware of the necessary poverty of the human condition. There was a spiritual poverty that Francis was aware of and that Francis embraced. And that poverty was this: Francis realized none of us is necessary. That not one of us is a necessary being. We could not make ourselves. We are not able to sustain ourselves. And we certainly are not able to save ourselves. But that in fact, all creatures, human beings, but also all the rest of creation, share in the innate poverty of being a creature. And the poverty of being a creature is we're not necessary. We need not be. And when you ask the basic philosophical question that everyone learns in Philosophy 101, why is there something rather than nothing? A possible answer is There's no rationale. It's all chance. It's just a freak of nature that somehow the biological and chemical elements came together in the Big Bang and we got life. That's one answer that could be given to the question. The answer that the Franciscan tradition gives to that question, why is there something rather than nothing? And it's really the answer that the Catholic Christian tradition gives, is because everything that is was loved into existence. Nothing that exists apart from the love of God. And it's God that created us and sustains us, and it is God who saves us. And Francis had that understanding that we have a commonality with creation that should lend us or lead us to have greater empathy or sympathy with all creatures, because there's a very real sense in which we are very much like the rest of creation, precisely because we are creatures and we are not autonomous and we are not self-saving and we are not self-creating, but like everything else in creation, it's a gift that comes from a loving God.
Ken, I think we probably have to start wrapping up.
Yes, we'll do that, Dave. 2 minutes more and we'll be done. Finally, subsidiarity and socialization. Two other, might say, principles of the Catholic social tradition. Subsidiarity can be explained there very simply as I put it: as much freedom as possible, as much government as necessary. That is, a healthy society is not a society with just individuals and a huge state, any more than a healthy economy is individuals and huge corporations. But healthy societies, political or economic, are societies that have lots of middle-level institutions, or what I'm calling their mediating institutions. That we're a healthier society when we have clubs, associations, when we have library book clubs and private schools, and we have mom and pop businesses, and we have family farms, as well as agribusiness and big corporations. When we have, barbershop quartets, and when we have bridge clubs, and when we have parishes, when we have service clubs. Many people live rich communal lives, and they don't do that through large mega institutions. They do it through more people-sized institutions that exist at more regional and local levels. And so the Catholic tradition wants to always sort of promote and hold up the need for local, regional community groups of all different types, because this is what makes for the richness and variety and diversity of communal life. That multiplicity of communities allows for each of us to pursue our interests, use our talents and gifts in the variety of ways in which they exist. So Dave, the final thing there, just summing it up. What I'm saying is, both last week and this week, as a person is both sacred and social, is that the Catholic social tradition is both communitarian and personalist. It wants to hold up the dignity of the person, but also wants to hold up that community is the vital mechanism whereby people experience their dignity. All beings are beings in relationship. All of us are called to live authentically and develop ourselves. And so let me close with this before I suggest a question for discussion. What I'm proposing is that when you understand the vision of the Catholic social tradition, it serves as an alternative emphasis to some of the more rugged individualism of American culture. It serves as an alternative to the isolationism so often of American foreign policy that thinks we only have to look out for ourselves. It serves as an alternative to the self-interested motives of American politics. I shouldn't vote simply or alone on how am I doing in the society. I need to be concerned with how others are doing, especially the others on the margins. And finally, it's an alternative to some of the crass materialism of American economic life that thinks, you know, the winner is the one who has more toys, that somehow the more I have, the more I am. And this tradition suggests that being and having are two different things.
Mhm.
And that in fact, many people can live rich lives without having to have many things that they possess. So if we go then finally, Dave, to that last slide. So here's the question I'd like to put out to you for some discussion in the small group before we come to the large group, and Dave will explain that. The question is this: do you think this kind of communitarian personalist perspective of Catholic social teaching, is this more of a challenge to us as Americans, or is it more of an affirmation of American culture? Do you find yourself thinking we come off pretty good in light of Catholic social thought, or as a society, are we somewhat seriously deficient in light of Catholic social thought? So Dave, I kick it back to you.
Okay, great. Briefly, just a reiteration from last week, questions are just a starting point. We shared in the breakout rooms for reference. We'll open up for any questions or comments at this point from anyone who would like to comment. You raise your hand and I'll recognize you.
What is that? That's pretty.
Anne?
Yeah, I did put something in the chat, but I don't know what happened. But
Oh, I see it. Would you comment on how the church is building synodality is becoming a catalyst for our own social teaching?
Oh. You know, this is going to sound like a cop out, and maybe it is. But next week we're going to spend the time talking precisely about the church as an institution and its interaction with society and how it does that. So I'll probably say something a little bit more intelligent about it next week than anything I'll say now off the top of my head. But it seems to me that what the synodality thing is about, properly understood, it seems to me, is precisely this point about transparency in institutions that I mentioned. That if there is an institution in which a lot of people feel as if the decisions are being made above their heads, it's the Catholic Church is one of those institutions. Where it doesn't seem as if most people have a voice, or if they have a voice, they don't get heard. So, I mean, I think, at least in principle, I applaud the idea of the synod and you know what the ambition is for it and its utility. Whether or not it's going to wind up being successful and whether or not it's going to have that impact that you'd like to see it have, I think that's more up for grabs than I wish it were. But you know, it just seems to me, without belaboring the point here, that the church oftentimes says wonderful things that itself doesn't live up to. And you can say, well, that's hypocrisy then. And there is some hypocrisy in it, but it's not only that, because I think we all say things that mean more than we're actually prepared to do, and you grow into some of the things you say. I mean, we talked about this the other night. Remember, I mean, you look at the Declaration of Independence and, all men are created equal. And the men that they were talking about were white male property owners. That was a man in the minds of the founders. If you weren't a property owner and you weren't white, you didn't matter, But gradually, all men are created equal. The power of those words did over time push and prod the American Republic to begin to broaden that understanding. So at least now in principle, we recognize it's all people, male and female, and it's not just white people and it's not just property owners. But that didn't come overnight, and it still has not been fully realized or achieved the way one might want. But the words served a useful thing because precisely we had to live with the words we professed, and it kind of served as a prod that kept this republic in a state of ongoing reform and renewal and the like. And I think you can hope that that's what goes on in the churches, that, you know, when we, the prayers that we profess, the prayers of the faithful or in the Eucharistic prayer, the, you know, the things that we claim to believe in, the words and the hymns that we sing, hopefully all those things do function as a kind of cry of conscience that keep asking us to be doing better than we actually are. But so the profession of the synod has a purpose, even if the purpose is only to point up to us how limited we've been in becoming the kind of church we'd like to be.
Yeah.
So I see a usefulness to it and a need for it, but I'm not entirely sure we're going to get out of it all that we'd like to get out of it.
Thank you.
Yes, Maureen, or,
It's
sorry,
Kevin, yeah.
Jim, yeah, I just saw the Maureen on the face, sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
Ken, thank you for your talk, because a couple takeaways for me is that we should be satisfied with the 10 sheep that we have, and that we should share the wool. And number one, and number two, we forget that we're in a world community. So often, especially now, we're drilled down about what's right and what's wrong with our country. And we forget about the poor and the needy, and our obligation as Catholic social teaching would have, to be more aware of the other countries. That there was an experiment, you know, in forming groups and in community. This whole idea of individual in the relation to a community. We forget that it's a world community. It's not the borders of the United States. And we need to be reminded, and thank you for that. Those were, for me at least, two profound takeaways from today.
Great, thank you, Jim.
Thanks,
Anybody
Kevin.
else?
You know, all I would just say to that, Kevin, is, you know, when most of the popes who wrote the early documents of Catholic social teaching, Leo XIII, Pius XI, and others, their view was very much Europe. They weren't even thinking about the United States in many ways, or North America. The focus was on sort of the European experience of the economy and the like. That's what, so that the documents themselves have actually pushed the papacy to take a somewhat more global view and worldview. And I think you're right. That tradition now really does try and promote a global perspective, but it took time for the papacy itself to realize the impact of its own words in those early encyclicals.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts, questions people would like to share? Yes, Ray,
Yeah, Phyllis,
Phyllis, okay.
we're together.
Okay, fine. Whoever wants to speak, speak.
When in our group, we were talking about how vast some of the concerns are and how small we feel. So I have an image of the size of an ocean, and you're in a rowboat. And those who would like to see more equity often can be very frustrated and lose hope. And I said, you know, so what bounced in my mind was something when we first started talking about pollution, is think globally, but act locally. And I just want to say that our parish gives me great hope. We have so much going on that is aiming to provide equity, and to kind of create a sense of enough. you know, when is enough enough?
Mhm.
And so I see a readiness there. I love our food pantry is so sensitive. I don't volunteer there. That's someone else's ministry, but I'm aware of it and I'm grateful that it exists, and it exists because of the whole community doing it, whether they give money or they're there hands-on. You can't do everything. And so the older I get, the more I like to share my money because it goes more places than I can get to. It's true. It's true, you know, there's just so many hours in a day and so much energy in a day.
Mhm.
So I'm just very grateful that we have such a loving, caring community, and that not one person has to do it all.
Yeah.
We do it all together. And a big part, I'm so pleased to see how the youth in our parish participate.
Hmm.
The role that I love that they're the sacristans, you know, the videographers, and when you have a place where you're willing to do that, you're in a good place.
Mhm.
When your gifts matter, when you have a place to give something. Well, anyway, I just want to say that, and that's enough. You get the idea.
A good idea, Phyllis.
Yeah, it's important because we can't lose hope, regardless of the outcomes.
Anybody else? Okay, I think we'll continue our conversation next Wednesday at 7. And we'll send a note out when this is ready to be posted, so others who weren't here can come and have a look at it. And I thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks, Father.
Good night.